One of the areas where motorcycles are different from cars is that they have individual controls for the front and rear brake. And there's a good reason for that. The front brakes and the rear brakes on a motorcycle have different roles. Though some of their jobs overlap, there are some situations where knowing when and how to use either the rear brake or the front brake, or the combination of the two, will save a drop or a crash. This week I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about the rear brake because that's often misunderstood on a motorcycle. So an easy generalization way to remember it is the front brakes are the primary stopping brake of the motorcycle and the rear brakes are the primary control brake. Now notice I didn't say the front was the stopping brake and the rear was the control brake, but I said they were the primary brake. That's because there are some areas where the front and rear they kind of bleed into each other, the use of them, and they assist each other to get the job done. But we'll get into those situations later in this video. So when it comes to which brake to use and when, there are two main questions I hear frequently, so let's get those out of the way first, right off the bat. First, you may be saying to yourself that my motorcycle's got linked brakes. How does that affect the braking technique and using the front or the rear brake? So if you don't know, linked brakes are if you put a little bit of rear brake, then a little bit of front brake gets applied also. And some motorcycles, if you apply a little bit of front brake, then the rear automatically gets applied also. Well, the simple answer to that is it doesn't affect your technique at all. It's just the same as a bike with non-link brakes. Many motorcycles have safety features on them that keep the riders from making mistakes, like using just one brake in an emergency stop. If you use just the front brake, if you've got link brakes, motorcycle will apply a little bit of rear brake to help in those situations. But remember, those safety features are a backup, often to poor rider technique. And if you're using proper technique on the motorcycle, then they're just something to keep in your back pocket and use in case you make a mistake. You want to learn proper technique and not rely on the motorcycle to make decisions for you. Besides, on many of the linked braking systems, if I apply just the front brake, it's going to apply just a percentage of the rear brake, and vice versa. If I apply just the rear brake, it's just going to apply a certain percentage of that front brake, and it may not be as effective as a proper technique would be. But again, I'm speaking in generalities here because linked braking systems are different on different motorcycles. You'll need to do a little bit of research and figure out which one or which type of link braking system your bike has, if in fact it does have link brakes. Also, it's important to understand during slow speed controls that many linked braking systems only are applicable after a certain speed is reached. So if you're going really slow on a motorcycle, which would be a proper place to use just the rear brake, if you're only going 5 or 10 miles an hour and you use just the rear brake, which is the proper technique, the linked braking system knows that you're going slower and it's not going to apply that front brake, which is a good thing, so it doesn't affect your technique at all. Just remember, keep that proper technique going and use the safety features as they were intended for as a backup to rider error. Another common question is, how does ABS affect brake use? Well, same thing here. Use proper technique and know that ABS is there as a backup. If the road conditions are bad or you make a mistake, it's got zero effect on how a rider is supposed to apply their brakes using proper technique. ABS is a great safety feature and I'm 100% for it, but it's there to serve as a backup if I panic and grab the brakes in an emergency situation or the road conditions are bad, but it's not a substitute for poor rider technique. So are there situations where only the rear brake should be used? Yes, anything below 10 miles per hour using just a little bit of rear brake, so applying just a slight pressure on that rear brake is going to help stabilize the motorcycle and help provide balance for the motorcycle. You can use that in conjunction with the friction zone where the clutch is partially engaged. A little bit of light pressure on the motorcycle is going to make it much easier to keep the motorcycle in balance when you're riding. So when you're performing U-turns, when you're performing really slow, tight turns from a stop, so like pulling out from a stop sign and turning a left or a right-hand turn, you can use a little bit of rear brake to help stabilize the bike in those situations. When pulling into a parking spot, when navigating around gas pumps, or any other situation where you're going really slow and you need extra balance and control, using a little bit of rear brake is going to help balance that motorcycle out and help you stay upright. If you use the front brake in those situations, especially when the handlebars are turned and you use enough pressure on the front brake to cause the forks to compress, well, that's a recipe for dropping the motorcycle, and it's the quickest way I know of for dropping a motorcycle. Slow speed, handlebars turned, enough pressure on that front brake to cause the forks to compress, you're probably going to drop the motorcycle. So this next thing I'll talk about is more of a personal preference of mine, but I've mentioned this before, and a lot of riders have found it really helpful also. That's whenever I pull up to a stoplight, I initiate braking with the front and the rear brake, but once I get to about 10 miles per hour, I ease off the front brake and use just the rear brake to finish the stop. What that does is it keeps the forks from compressing a whole lot, allows the motorcycle to stop in a lot more balance. So if the road is a little bit off level, if the forks are compressed, the motorcycle wants to lean in that direction when you come to a stop. Less so if you just use the rear brakes for that last 5 or 10 miles per hour. Keeps a little bit of pressure off the front forks, and the bike stops much more in balance by stopping or using the last 5 or 10 miles per hour of your stopping using that rear brake. So try that next time you're out for a ride and see what you think. You know, personally, I really like it. At motorcycle stops, I've been doing it for a long time, and it really does help keep the motorcycle in balance. So give that a try next time you go for a ride. The front and rear brake also have different techniques if you happen to lock one of them up. If you lock the front brake up, so you squeeze it too quick at the start, front tire locks up, you want to release that front brake and reapply it with a progressive squeeze. If you do that, it is going to extend your stopping distance because you've had to go off the brakes and then back on, but it's better than the likely crash that's going to happen by keeping that front brake locked up. On the rear brake, if you lock it up, you can keep pressure on the rear brake and go ahead and keep that tire locked up, especially if you're riding in a straight line. It's probably just going to fishtail the motorcycle back and forth as you come to a stop, but it's not going to really get you, out of sorts where you're in a huge danger of crashing. If you're on a corner, though, let's say you're going around a corner and you put too much rear brake on, that rear tire is going to start to slide around. That is going to probably cause you a crash if you keep it locked up. But in that situation, it's a better crash than the alternative. So let me explain that. You come around the corner and you lock that tire up. If you keep it locked up, the bike's just going to slide out this way. You're now on this side of the motorcycle as the motorcycle slides across. What happens if you release that brake? You're going into the corner, you lock that tire up, it starts sliding around. If you release that rear brake, the motorcycle then is going to want to snap back into position. What that's going to do is cause a catapult effect, and it's going to throw you over the top and the front of the motorcycle. So now you're on this side, you're tumbling, and a motorcycle is tumbling behind you, and your motorcycle's ticked off because you just crashed it. So you're better off, even in that situation, to keep the rear brake locked up, have an easier crash by crashing to the low side rather than coming over the top and having a high side crash, which is a much worse situation. So remember I said earlier that I was a huge believer in ABS? Well, this is where ABS helps, especially cornering ABS for that situation we just talked about, because cornering ABS takes in consideration the lean angle of the motorcycle and how much brake pressure you can apply without locking it up. So it's going to make up for a lot of bad rider mistakes. That cornering ABS, well, just normal ABS is probably not going to help you too much in a corner. Cornering ABS will, and it makes up for bad rider technique or mistakes out on the road. So as I was prepared for this video, I tried to think of some situations where using just the front brake would be the proper technique. And the only thing I could really think of is trail braking, where using the front brake is the proper procedure for doing that. So trail braking, if you don't know, you're coming into a corner, you begin to lean the motorcycle in. Well, first off, before you get to the corner, you're using the front and rear brake to slow the motorcycle down. As you lean the motorcycle in, you're going to maintain a little bit of pressure on that front brake. That's going to compress the forks. and that's going to help the motorcycle turn a little bit sharper. It's also going to keep more weight on that front tire, giving that front tire more traction when you need it. Then as you get around the corner, about to the apex, and you can see through the corner, you're comfortable with your direction and your speed, then you can smoothly release that front brake and apply throttle as you straighten the motorcycle up and exit out of the corner. So essentially that's what trail braking is. If you want more information on that, I've got a whole lot of videos on that. Do a YouTube search for MCrider and trail braking, and you'll find a bunch of other videos on that subject. So other than that, if you're on the front brake, I can't think of another situation where a rider would want to use just the front brake and not use the front brake in combination with the rear brake. You know, a lot of sport bike riders say they never use the rear brake, though the rear brake is less effective on a sport bike due to the rake of the motorcycle. The front tire is much more under the front of the motorcycle, so you've got a lot more stopping power on the front of the bike, less so on the rear of the bike. But you're essentially giving up 10% of your stopping power in an emergency by not using the rear brake. So it makes no sense to me not to use the front and the rear brake every time you come to a stop, even if you're on a motorcycle. But I'd be interested in hearing from you. Are there other legitimate situations where using the front brake alone is the preferred method for using the brake? So leave a comment below if you can think of something else. To be honest, the only situation I could think of was trail braking, where it's the preferred technique to use the front brake to get the motorcycle into the corner. You know, we can also over-rely on the rear brake, and that's much more common with cruiser riders. Because of the design of a cruiser, it's got more weight on the rear end, especially if you've got a passenger back there. The bike is much more biased towards the rear tire than it would be on a sport bike. And a lot of crashes happen on the road because a rider tries to use, or they get in the habit of just using the rear brake to come to a stop. And then when they need it in an emergency situation, they don't have enough stopping power. They apply more rear brake and they end up locking the rear brake up and crashing as a result of it. But can you stop at a stoplight using just the rear brake? Well, the answer to that is yes. But is it a good habit to develop using just the rear brake for a stop? The answer to that is no, because the brakes are drastically less effective when you need to stop quickly. And if you're using the rear brake alone, on a cruiser, you're losing 70 to 80% of your braking power by using just the rear brake alone. So every time you come to a stop sign or a stoplight, initiate your braking with the front and the rear brake. And then if you want to, you can try that technique the last 5 or 10 miles per hour with the rear brake alone. But you always want to go to the brakes in tandem, other than those exceptions that we've already talked about. So in summary, it's good to know how your motorcycle works, what safety features it's got on it, and how those safety features are applied to the particular motorcycle that you ride. But they're not a substitute for good riding technique. You want to learn proper technique, and you want to keep all the safety features in your back pocket in case you make a mistake on the road or the road conditions play a role in your stopping power. Till next week, guys, it's Kevin with MCrider, and I'll see you on the road. There's a whole lot more to MCrider than just the weekly videos. Go to mcrider.com/member. You'll get instant access to the forums and the field guide. You get ad-free MCrider videos and a whole lot more. Go to mcrider.com/member for all the details.